Prince William seizes control of the crisis-hit British monarchy from the politically weak and physically dying King Charles after a fortnight-long extraordinary power struggle which the corrupted MSM have agreed not to report.
Well, I think it will be very difficult for him to say in Windsor, because I think very much the force behind this has come from Prince of Wales William and his wife Kate. I think they just didn't want to be neighbours to Andrew. That his son wants a completely different monarchy. He wants to modernise it, he wants to reduce it, he wants to strip it of a lot of the chivalry and traditions which Charles has done his best to nurture.
Will it do the job? Has the problem now gone away, do you think?
I would hope with all reasonable people it will have gone away. It's hard to think what more His Majesty could do. His Majesty has literally...
Breaking tonight, something unprecedented has erupted inside Britain's most sacred walls. For the first time in modern memory, Prince William, the future King of the United Kingdom, has publicly confronted the Prime Minister. His words, delivered with icy precision, sent shockwaves through Westminster and tore through the royal silence that had held for generations. This wasn't a polite disagreement. It was a royal warning, a moral rebuke from a man who represents the soul of the nation, aimed directly at a government accused of betraying those who defend it. It began quietly. Reports emerged of massive defence budget cuts, reductions so severe that senior commanders warned they would leave the UK toothless in any global conflict. Keir Starmer, determined to reshape Britain's finances, framed it as a strategic reallocation. But to many within the forces, it was a humiliation. Bases closed, training slashed, veterans ignored. And as public outrage grew, a speech from the Prince of Wales turned a simmering scandal into a national firestorm. Standing before rows of uniformed veterans in Manchester, Prince William broke every unspoken rule of royal neutrality. His tone was calm, but every word carried thunder. "We ask our men and women to serve," he said, "but we must also serve them." Those 10 words detonated across the country like a political grenade. Within minutes, the clip flooded every platform, TikTok, X and Sky News loops, millions watching as the heir to the throne seemingly accused the Prime Minister of betraying Britain's defenders. Downing Street went silent. For nearly 2 hours, no official response. Then came the statement, cautious, defensive and trembling with unease. "The government respects the contributions of our armed forces," it read, "and continues to ensure Britain's security through efficient spending." Efficient spending's a phrase that instantly became a symbol of political cowardice. Journalists tore it apart. Commentators called it an insult wrapped in bureaucracy. And across the barracks, soldiers spoke openly of a royal who finally gets it. The tension didn't end there. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior aides were said to be horrified. The monarchy, they whispered, does not challenge Parliament. Yet behind closed doors, it was clear this wasn't a mistake. Prince William had planned it. He had been briefed for weeks about the consequences of the cuts. He'd spoken privately with military charities and commanders. He knew what he was saying, and more importantly, he knew what it meant. This was not just a speech, it was defiance. Starmer, sources claim, was furious. That evening, he summoned his advisors and communications team. "We can't have the future king dictating defence policy," one insider quoted him as saying. "If we let this pass, he becomes untouchable." But the damage was done. Overnight polls showed an extraordinary swing. Public confidence in Starmer's leadership plunged, while respect for the prince soared to record levels. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about loyalty, duty, and the meaning of Britain itself. By morning, newspapers across the country carried the same headline: "William breaks silence, Palace versus Parliament." Commentators on both sides of the aisle asked the same question. Had the monarchy just declared moral war on the government? Some saw courage, others saw recklessness, but no one could deny what had happened. The future king had drawn a line in the sand, and Britain was watching which side its leaders would stand on. Then came the whispers of a deeper divide. Palace insiders claimed that King Charles had privately urged his son to remain measured, fearing that the crown could be dragged into partisan fire. But William, driven by something stronger than protocol, refused to soften. If the state abandons its defenders, he reportedly told a friend, then what is left to defend? That single sentence began circulating like wildfire, a haunting echo of a nation's forgotten conscience. Meanwhile, veterans began marching. Outside Parliament, crowds of servicemen, families and supporters gathered with placards reading, "Back the Prince, not the cuts." What began as a simple policy dispute now looked like the opening act of a constitutional storm. The royal family was split, the king urging restraint, the heir demanding justice, while the prime minister faced the greatest crisis of his tenure. The world was watching Britain's foundations tremble. In just 24 hours, one speech had redrawn the lines of power. The palace could no longer claim silence and the government could no longer claim control. Something had shifted permanently. The question now was no longer whether the cuts would stand, but whether the country itself could withstand the fallout. Because when a prince takes a moral stand against his own prime minister, the crisis stopped being political. It becomes historic. And deep inside Downing Street, as aides scrambled to contain the story, one phrase kept echoing in the corridors of power. He's not just the prince anymore, he's the people's conscience. Britain was awake, but not in peace. The storm that began with a speech had turned into a full-scale reckoning. Newspapers screamed of royal defiance. Social media pulsed with fury, awe and confusion. And inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, silence was replaced by the restless echo of consequence. What Prince William had done could not be undone. And the entire country was now choosing sides. Downing Street entered crisis mode. Keir Starmer, who had once projected calm and control, now looked cornered. Leaked memos revealed frantic meetings, midnight calls to advisors, and desperate instructions to regain the narrative. But how do you regain control when the future king has become the voice of the people? Every attempt to frame the cuts as necessary reform sounded hollow. Every statement from a minister was drowned beneath the rising tide of public anger. The turning point came during a live BBC interview when a reporter asked a question no one dared before. "Prime Minister," she said, "if the Crown itself questions your loyalty to Britain's defenders, why should the public trust you?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Starmer's face tightened. He tried to pivot, to blame economic realities, but his words fell flat. The clip went viral within hours. Across Britain, even loyal Labour supporters began asking the same question. The image of a strong, steady leader shattered, replaced by a man out of his depth, trapped between power and principle. Inside the palace, tension was worse. King Charles summoned his son for what aides described as a private, stern discussion. Witnesses said voices were raised. Charles reminded William of the Crown's sacred neutrality, that the monarchy survives only by standing above politics. But William's answer, according to insiders, was chillingly calm. "Father," he said, "if silence means complicity, then neutrality is no longer an option." Those words, though spoken behind closed doors, somehow leaked. And once again, the public took sides, not between Prime Minister and opposition, but between King and Prince. For the first time in decades, Britain's royal family stood visibly divided. Some senior courtiers sided with Charles, urging quiet diplomacy. Others whispered that William's courage had restored the moral spine of the monarchy. Even the Queen Consort was said to be uneasy, warning that once the Crown enters politics, it can never leave. Yet outside those palace walls, something extraordinary was happening. Crowds were gathering not in protest, but in loyalty. Veterans marched with portraits of the Prince. Families waved flags, not for party, but for principle. The monarchy, long accused of irrelevance, had suddenly become the heartbeat of resistance. Meanwhile, Starmer's circle was imploding. Rachel Reeves reportedly warned him that the crisis could destroy the government within weeks. Leaked emails revealed bitter infighting, ministers accusing one another of mishandling the backlash, MPs threatening rebellion, and donors pulling funds. The Prime Minister's approval rating plunged to its lowest since taking office. The Labour Party, once triumphant, now looked fractured, defensive and afraid. And in the midst of this chaos, whispers began to grow louder, whispers of resignation. But Starmer wasn't ready to surrender. Late one night, under the dim lights of Number 10, he made a decision that would ignite Britain even further. He would strike back, not at the protesters, not at the press, but at the palace itself. Sources claim he ordered an investigation into royal interference in state affairs. A veiled warning, a declaration that even the Crown could be challenged. Within hours, the news broke. Headlines screamed of an unprecedented constitutional showdown. The Prime Minister versus the future King. Parliament versus the palace. The people versus power itself. That clip became legend. Commentators called it the moment Britain's conscience spoke. Thousands flooded social media with messages of support. Number signs "Stand with William" trended across the world. Even former military officers broke protocol to speak publicly, praising the prince's courage. The country was no longer debating policy, or it was witnessing a moral uprising. The establishment, for the first time in a generation, was being held accountable by its own future. Behind the scenes, foreign leaders watched closely. Reports claimed that US President Donald Trump, never one to stay silent, called Starmer's leadership a disaster in uniform. India's Prime Minister Modi described the situation as a warning for those who forget their soldiers. And in Moscow, Russian state TV mocked the chaos, calling Britain a kingdom at war with itself. The global humiliation only deepened Starmer's isolation. As night fell over London, the city glowed with unease. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, chanting not in anger, but in solidarity. It felt less like a protest and more like a vigil, a quiet, determined stand for dignity. Britain, the land of stoicism and restraint, was suddenly ablaze with emotion. And for the first time in years, the royal family had become more than a symbol. It had become a voice, but deep inside Number 10, another kind of fire was burning. Advisors warned Starmer that if he continued to provoke the palace, he could trigger a full constitutional crisis. The Prime Minister listened, then simply said, "Let it come." Those 3 words marked the point of no return, because what started as a political dispute was now something far more dangerous, a struggle for the moral soul of the nation. The next move would decide everything. Would the government survive the storm? Or would Britain's oldest institution remind the world that crowns too can carry the weight of conscience? It was the week Britain stopped pretending everything was fine. The clash that began as a quiet dispute over defence budgets had exploded into something historic. A confrontation that reached the very heart of the kingdom. The Prime Minister stood defiant, the Prince unyielding, and the Crown itself was now trapped in a storm no one could contain. For days, the headlines told only one story: the heir to the throne versus the head of government. And the people, divided yet awakened, began to ask the question that haunted every corridor of power. Who truly speaks for Britain now? Downing Street grew darker by the hour. Ministers resigned. MPs whispered of rebellion. The cabinet, once united under Starmer's iron control, was fracturing under pressure. Inside Parliament, the opposition smelled blood. Nigel Farage thundered in the Commons that Starmer had declared war on the monarchy itself. Even members of Starmer's own party sat in stunned silence as the Prime Minister lashed out at royal interference, his voice rising, his hands trembling. Cameras caught it all, a leader unravelling on live television. But while Westminster fell into chaos, Buckingham Palace faced a crisis of its own. King Charles convened an emergency meeting with his senior advisors. The footage of his son's defiance had already gone global. The monarchy, once untouchable, was now at the centre of a political earthquake. Some urged the king to issue a formal statement distancing the crown from the controversy. Others begged him to protect the institution by defending his son's moral stance. Tradition demanded silence, conscience demanded speech. And for a man raised on the weight of both, the choice was unbearable. Then, quietly, the palace released a short, solemn message. It read, "His Majesty recognises the deep concerns expressed by the Prince of Wales regarding the welfare of Britain's armed forces. The Crown's loyalty to those who serve remains unwavering." It was only 2 sentences long, but it was enough to send the entire government into freefall, because behind those words was a truth impossible to ignore. The king had sided, however subtly, with his son. The monarchy had spoken. The streets of London were overflowing. Veterans, students, families, all marching together under the banner of duty before politics. The air was thick with anger and pride. Union Jacks waved beneath the orange streetlights as chants echoed through Westminster. William for Britain! Starmer out. It was no longer about policy. It was rebellion. Not in arms, but in spirit. A moral uprising against what many saw as betrayal at the top. Inside number 10, panic turned to paralysis. Intelligence reports warned that mass demonstrations were planned outside Parliament. Senior military figures privately signalled support for the Prince's message. Some even threatened resignation if the cuts proceeded. The system itself in Parliament, Palace and the public was tearing apart. The foundations of British power were cracking under the weight of conscience. Then came the moment that would define the crisis. During a tense session in the House of Commons, Starmer stood up to announce an independent inquiry into the royal role in government matters. But before he could finish, opposition MPs erupted in fury. Shouts filled the chamber. Shame! Disgrace! You've lost the country! It was chaos and centuries of decorum collapsing in seconds. The Speaker's gavel thundered, but the noise only grew louder. Outside, as news broke, the crowd swelled until the police could no longer hold the line, and then, as if history itself had chosen its moment, the doors of Buckingham Palace opened. Cameras captured Prince William stepping onto the balcony, unannounced, unguarded, his face calm but resolute. The roar that followed shook London. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In that silence, the people saw what they'd been waiting for. Leadership, not from Parliament, but from the heart of the nation. Within 24 hours, Starmer's government collapsed. Cabinet resignations piled up. Parliament was suspended amid security fears. The Prime Minister appeared briefly outside number 10, pale and exhausted, delivering a short and bitter address. I acted for the economy, he said, but was crucified for it. Then he turned and walked inside. His political career finished, his authority shattered. Across Britain, bells rang, not in celebration, but in awe. The crisis had ended the way all moral struggles do, not with victory, but with clarity. The monarchy had not seized power. It had simply reminded the nation of something forgotten. That leadership without loyalty is hollow, and power without duty is doomed. In the weeks that followed, the cuts were reversed. Military funding was restored. The public mood began to heal, though scars remained. King Charles resumed his duties, quieter but prouder, and Prince William, the man who dared to speak when silence was easier, became a symbol of conviction in an age of compromise. Foreign leaders watched in stunned respect. Trump called it the moment Britain found its backbone. Modi said it was the rebirth of honour. Even Putin, in his cold way, admitted that the crown still has steel. For once, Britain's turmoil had become its strength and proof that the oldest democracy in the world could still face its conscience and reason. And yet, within the palace walls, one truth lingered. Britain had been tested, and so had its heirs. The king had chosen duty, the prince had chosen courage, the government had chosen power and lost everything. In the end, the crisis wasn't just about budgets or speeches, it was about the soul of a nation that nearly forgot who it was. As the final line of the documentary voiceover would say then, in the kingdom that almost broke, one voice reminded Britain what it means to serve. And somewhere in the quiet of Windsor Castle, the future king of the United Kingdom looked out at the mist over London, the city he had shaken to its core, and whispered to himself, duty first, always.